Right now, as the United States gears up to celebrate its 250th birthday, a massive, invisible, and highly dangerous weather system has essentially swallowed half the continent. You look up at the skies over Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, or Chicago, and you might just see a clear, brilliant blue. But the atmosphere itself, it is heavy. It's suffocating. Temperatures are aggressively surging to levels we've rarely witnessed in modern history, and it's actively transforming a holiday built on outdoor gatherings into a full-blown nationwide emergency.
So that is the defining, immediate crisis of this July 4th weekend. What actually happens when one of the busiest, most heavily traveled celebration periods of the entire calendar year violently collides with a weather event of this unprecedented scale? Let me be clear, this is no longer just another hot summer day. We are watching a cascading disaster unfold, one that is currently threatening the physical health of millions, fundamentally warping physical infrastructure, and pushing our fragile electrical grid to the absolute brink of failure.
180 million people, that's nearly half of the entire United States population, currently trapped under major or extreme heat risk. From the sweeping plains of the Midwest to the dense, concrete-heavy urban corridors of the East Coast, the sheer geographic footprint of this event is honestly staggering. As we speak, local emergency management agencies across more than 24 states are scrambling in real time. They are working around the clock to retrofit public buildings into emergency cooling centers and rapidly expand medical services just to prevent emergency rooms from being completely overwhelmed. In this explainer, we're going to break all of this down. First, the Independence Day heat dome. Then, the anatomy of a heat dome. After that, straining the American grid, followed by travel and human impact. And finally, we'll look at the climate reality. Let's dive right into part one, the Independence Day heat dome, where 160 million face extreme risks. At this exact moment, this scorching weather system is stretching its grip across 30 states. And the timing couldn't be worse, right? As millions of Americans are gathering for parades, outdoor festivals, and fireworks to mark the nation's 250th Independence Day. We're looking at heat indices and temperatures forecast to reach anywhere between 100 and 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Just imagine hundreds of thousands of people packed onto the National Mall, standing shoulder to shoulder on radiating concrete as temperatures push way past 100 degrees. Washington, D.C. is forecast to hit 101, which would officially shatter a century-old city record set all the way back in 1919. Just slightly north, New Jersey is enduring its single hottest day in 15 years. Local municipalities are literally making desperate, last-minute calls right now on whether to cancel public gatherings entirely just to prevent mass casualties. Which brings us to Section 2, Anatomy of a Heat Dome, and what caused this massive event. To truly understand the sheer magnitude of this threat, we have to look directly at the science. What exactly is driving this extreme, unrelenting heat? Well, the answer lies in a specific, stubborn atmospheric anomaly. Think of a heat dome like a giant, invisible lid heavily placed over the country. An intense high-pressure atmospheric condition essentially parks itself over a massive region and simply refuses to budge. Usually driven by a stagnant jet stream, this atmospheric lid completely halts our natural weather progression. It prevents convection. It prevents precipitation. And what that means is cooling cloud cover physically cannot form to block the sun's radiation, so the boiling air at the surface simply has nowhere to escape. This massive atmospheric lid forms in 4 distinct compounding stages. First, a vast mass of warm air builds up in the lower atmosphere, and high pressure from above pushes that warm air aggressively downward. Second, as that air gets pushed down, it is fiercely compressed. Because its heat is now relentlessly squeezed into a continuously shrinking volume, its temperature violently spikes. Third, as that incredibly hot air naturally attempts to rise again, the high-pressure system acts as an impenetrable cap, forcing it right back down to the surface. It's a brutal feedback loop. And finally, this creates a deeply self-sustaining cycle where the heat is trapped, constantly intensified, and baked by uninterrupted sunlight day after scorching day. Moving to Section 3, straining the American grid and the very real risk of rolling blackouts. Because the story doesn't end with just dangerous meteorology. When you have this much heat trapped over 30 states simultaneously, millions of air conditioners turn on at the exact same second. That pushes our daily utilities to the absolute brink. This system began quietly in the Midwest in late June, slowly and methodically marching eastward. But by the morning of July 2nd, we crossed a critical threshold. The U.S. Department of Energy took the exceptionally rare step of declaring an official grid emergency. By that afternoon, PJM Interconnection, which is one of the largest grid operators in the country, was granted permission to temporarily waive environmental pollution limits. What that means is power plants are currently allowed to burn fuel at maximum unrestricted capacity, literally sacrificing local air quality just to keep the lights on. These are unprecedented break glass measures deployed solely to prevent a total grid collapse during a major holiday.
And here is exactly why that matters. 166,304. That is the staggering peak megawatt demand forecasted for the PJM grid alone. To put the gravity of that number in perspective for you, PJM supplies critical power to about 65 million people stretching across 13 states and Washington, D.C. This forecasted surge utterly shatters their previous all-time record, a number that hasn't been touched since 2006. If the physical infrastructure cannot handle this load, controlled rolling blackouts become a very real imminent possibility. And look, a rolling blackout during a 100-plus degree heat wave isn't just an inconvenience. For folks reliant on oxygen machines, refrigeration for medicine, or simple air conditioning in a high-rise apartment, it is a life-threatening emergency. Now to Section 4, Travel and Human Impact, covering the disruptions and dangers in daily life. Because now another huge problem has emerged. As millions of everyday Americans attempted to travel for the long weekend, they hit a sudden, literal wall. Amtrak was forced to outright cancel a dozen trains on the busy Northeast Corridor and drastically reduce speeds on countless others. The reason? It's terrifyingly simple. When ambient temperatures exceed 95 degrees, extreme heat physically causes solid steel rails to expand and warp under the sun, creating a severe, unpredictable derailment risk. Simultaneously, the heat has compromised air travel. Ronald Reagan Airport in D.C. has had to suspend specific flight operations, and local transit networks like Philadelphia's SEPTA are experiencing cascading systemic delays. People are just finding themselves stranded in sweltering transit hubs with literally nowhere to go. At first glance, you might assume you know who is ending up in the hospital right now. But when we look at historical health data from heavily impacted areas like New Jersey, a very stark, immediate pattern emerges. Heat-related illness does not impact the population equally. The highest rates of emergency department visits consistently strike adults aged 20 to 59. These are often our outdoor workers, the construction crews, the landscapers, the event staff working 10-hour shifts to set up July 4th stages and fireworks displays. Equally at risk are those over 80 years old, a highly vulnerable demographic that can succumb to heat stroke in a matter of hours if they live alone and suddenly lose access to their air conditioning. This brings us to a vital life or death warning that local health departments are aggressively pushing across every available channel this weekend. A parked car can reach 100 degrees in less than 10 minutes on a standard 80-degree day. But trapped inside this specific heat dome, it takes just 2 minutes for a vehicle's interior to reach unsafe, highly lethal temperatures. Furthermore, a child's body physically warms 3 to 5 times faster than an adult's. It is a stark, urgent reminder of the deadly microenvironments this weather system is actively creating on every single street corner. And the sheer scale of the human impact is remarkably varied depending on where you look across the map. On the East Coast, the ongoing FIFA World Cup has been forced into an unprecedented operational shift, officially mandating emergency cooling breaks for athletes in the middle of every single half just to prevent sheer physiological collapse on the pitch. But while the East Coast bakes under crushing humidity, the Western United States is facing a totally different, highly combustible crisis. Over 2 million people in the Four Corner states are currently under severe fire alerts. Dozens of massive, uncontained wildfires are already scorching more than 580,000 acres, placing an unimaginable strain on emergency responders who are forced to fight raging infernos while wearing heavy gear in 100-degree ambient heat. Literally no region of the country is completely spared from this system's reach. Finally, Section 5, the climate reality and what experts expect next. To truly understand the expert perspective on what's unfolding, you have to understand how scientists actually measure this level of risk. Today, experts increasingly rely on a metric called the wet bulb globe temperature, or WBGT, rather than just reading a standard outdoor thermometer. And here's why that matters. This heat dome hasn't just trapped hot air. It has trapped immense, suffocating amounts of moisture. High humidity makes it incredibly difficult for the human body to cool down. It's not just the heat, it's the fact that your body's primary natural cooling mechanism, evaporating sweat, is rendered completely useless by the heavy moisture already sitting in the air. When your sweat cannot evaporate, your core temperature rises dangerously and uncontrollably fast. The WBGT values recorded during this event are hitting unprecedented, record-breaking highs. Which leads us to a powerful, verified reality check from Theodore Keeping, an extreme weather researcher analyzing the data with the World Weather Attribution Group. He points out a sobering fact. This is fundamentally not the climate of 1776. According to the latest rapid attribution climate models, researchers have concluded that the extreme heat and humidity currently broiling the continental United States would have been virtually impossible without the combined amplified effects of current El Niño conditions and human-induced climate change, which has significantly raised baseline global temperatures. We are quite literally celebrating the nation's 250th birthday in an atmosphere our founders would not recognize.
And that brings us to the ultimate question we're left to confront as the fireworks fade. 180 million people at risk. Warped steel train tracks. A power grid pushed past its absolute breaking point, forcing environmental regulations to be bypassed just to keep the lights on. If stationary, high-pressure heat domes of this magnitude are becoming a more frequent, expected fixture of our summer months, how exactly do we adapt? When a single weather event can systematically shut down a modern nation's infrastructure in a matter of days, it's vividly clear that our electrical grids, our transit systems, and our community safety nets require a profound, immediate reevaluation. Preparation and community resilience, they're just no longer optional. Stay safe out there, check on your neighbors, and thank you for joining me for this explainer.